I'm very grateful to be here tonight, and I would like to praise both ECCHR and Air Wars, not just for the incredible level of professionalism that they have displayed since we started working together, but also for the fact that they're incredibly passionate people. I also welcome our three panelists here tonight, and the panelists that will be joining us for the second session. And I hope that we will be able to come up with tools and recommendations to avoid what happened in Al-Mansoura, to prevent it from happening ever again. So on this very same day, 2 years ago, a US strike hit the Al-Badhiya school, a shelter for internally displaced people in the town of Mansoura, near the Euphrates River, southwest of Islamic State stronghold city of Raqqa. The strike killed approximately 150 people, and less than 48 hours later, 44 civilians, including 14 children, were allegedly killed after bombs hit a market and a bakery in the town of Tabqa. The Raqqa campaign was intended to recapture several territories from Islamic State, and it lasted approximately 11 months. US Central Command, CENTCOM, established a combined joint task force to coordinate coalition forces, amongst which we have France, the UK, and Germany, together with the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, the famous SDF. Overall, as reported by the organization Air Wars, and we have here a representative, 2,000 non-combatants were credibly reported killed. At least 1,400 civilians perished in coalition and artillery strikes before the city's capture in mid-October. More than 21,000 munitions were fired on Raqqa in just 5 months, and these were many times more than all the munitions released in Afghanistan in the same year. Air Wars reports that only 40 fatalities have so far been conceded in the Mansoura strike. In the report, War of Annihilation, Devastating Toll on Civilians, Amnesty states that there are still gaping holes in the coalition's insistence that their forces did enough to minimize civilian casualties. And statements from US government officials indicate that US authorities have changed the process for approval of strikes in ways which could be contributing to higher civilian casualties overall. Germany, which as mentioned before is part of the coalition, acknowledged its role in the strike by providing images of the target site as well as damage assessment flights after the strike. We will hear more about Germany in the next panel. So the questions we would like to have answered tonight are: how does this huge gap between numbers reported by civil society groups and governments come about? What can be done to obtain more realistic numbers? And how can tragedies such as those of Tabqa and Mansoura be avoided in the future? So on this first panel, we have James Rodehaver from the UN Commission of Inquiry on Syria, Fadel Abdul-Ghani, who is the founder and chairman of the Syrian Network for Human Rights, and Nadim Houri, who is the director of Terrorism and Counterterrorism Program at Human Rights Watch. I would like to first turn to Nadim and ask a bit more about the Human Rights Watch investigation on this case.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for the invite. Thank you for the introduction and for the opportunity to talk about what happened in Mansoura 2 years ago, a strike that I investigated with a colleague of mine in July 2017 during a visit to the site. So I'll just walk you through a bit our investigation, what we found, the changing position of the coalition, and where we are at today. So maybe a bit of background. The Mansoura school, it's commonly known as the Badhiya school. It's actually a boarding school. Badhiya just means steppes in Syria. You know, it's the area where it is. It's sort of semi-steppish kind of, grazing ground. It was opened in 2009. This is a photo from its opening. With great fanfare, it was a boarding school for people who would come and study at high school, and some of the teenagers would actually stay and live in it. And then when the crisis in Syria, the revolution, the uprising began in 2011, shortly thereafter, the school stopped operating as a school, and many displaced Syrians, notably at the time from Homs and Palmyra, moved to it. What people don't actually remember now is basically in the period of 2012, 2013, Raqqa and the area became known as the Hotel of the Revolution. It was a relatively safer area than other parts of Syria, so many displaced moved to that area, and that school became quite a known place for those displaced to live in. And you can see it's a 3-story building. It's quite a large building. Now, then something happened, which I think is an important context to what we'll talk about. As Mosul and other Iraqi cities started falling, there were new waves of displaced. These were people and families who were affiliated with ISIS fighters, right? Because they also retired, they retreated from Iraq and from other areas that they were losing in the Syrian desert. And in the school, particularly on the first floor, a number of families of ISIS members came and settled. Now, we don't know exactly how many numbers, but we've had from many survivors that there were some families of ISIS members that moved in shortly thereafter. But what's important is that many of those who were displaced before stayed. Okay, so I mean, again, it's important to also notify, to just sort of mention that just because you're affiliated with ISIS as a family member doesn't make you a legitimate target. But I'm just presenting to you things factually as we investigated them. And maybe just to add some more background, and I think you started mentioning it. The strike happened in a particularly important point. So this is a map. Actually, there's a bit of light, so maybe you won't see. What's sort of dark in the middle is the river. You see Tabqa, you see the Badhiya school. It's actually, everyone says it's in Mansoura, but it's on a road south of Mansoura. It's actually quite isolated. There's nothing around it on the road down. And basically, in November 2016, the SDF and the CJTF, basically the coalition, announced the start of the operation to capture Raqqa. Now, they started by taking Tabqa, and then they moved on to Raqqa. You can see actually Raqqa, it was further east. The offensive to take control of the Tabqa Dam. The Tabqa Dam is actually one of the biggest dams in Syria. It's a very strategic point. It was a very important battle. That offensive began on March 22nd. Okay, that date is very important. I mean, that's 2 days after the strike. Because what happened was, in the 5 days preceding March 22nd, in the 5 days before that operation, the frequency of airstrikes on that area increased dramatically. And I gave you some stats. Just between March 19th to March 23rd, there were 85 strikes on the Raqqa area. That was actually more than double the strikes from the preceding 5 days. Okay? And this is around this time where the attack on the Badhiya school occurred, and another attack which we also documented on the market in Tabqa, which to this day actually the coalition has not reported on. And actually I believe in the market we may have even seen more casualties than what we saw in the Mansoura school, but it's even harder to document. I'll talk a bit about casualties and numbers in a second. So this happens in March. There are Syrian groups that relay there are a lot of casualties, but immediately the coalition basically in March and in April say, no, there's nothing. This was purely an ISIS center. 30 ISIS members were killed. There are no civilians. In July, so I managed to go with a colleague of mine to visit the school, and we spent 2 areas in the area, because by that point it had been retaken and it was under the control of the SDF. We spoke to 11 people, including 2 survivors, but also other people who had first-hand knowledge of the attack. Either people who were first responders, so actually people who lived in the area who pulled people from the rubble and buried them, or actually people who were living close enough to the school. Again, there's nothing around the school. You can see from some of the footage, it's not in the middle of a city, but you had some houses and some tented settlements. So what did we find? What does the investigation find? Okay, so first of all, the details from the survivors. So basically, it's in the evening. It's around 11 p.m. And these are a couple of testimonies that I sort of selected. One of them was from a survivor. She's 20, now she's 24. I think she must have been 22 at the time. Basically, 11 p.m., people had gone to bed, and she remembers 2 strikes, chaos, comes out and collapses. And I believe the only reason she actually survived was she was probably ejected from the building. I mean, I'll show you pictures from the building afterwards. There was not much left. And those who survived were probably those who were sleeping very close to the windows. After the first and the second strike, the explosion actually pushed them out. So they were actually badly wounded, but I believe survived. Because one of the local men who lived about 100 meters from the school, he actually described 4 bombs, hearing 4 bombs. To this day, we don't know exactly how many bombs were dropped, and we were not able to find remnants of the weapons in the rubble when we visited. But if we look at the next slide, this is the school. Now, this is a photo that was actually taken by ISIS right after the attack. If you remember the first photo, you saw part of it as a school opening. I mean, this was a massive, almost like Berlin, you know, East Germany, Soviet-style building, 3 stories high, U-shaped. This is what's left of it after that one night of strikes. And actually, by the time we visited in July, there was even further destruction on the left. That was caused, according to local witnesses, as people were trying to dig people from the rubble. You know, with the they had to destroy some of these things. So really, this was not a casual strike. There was an intention to destroy the building entirely. Maybe if we go to the next slide. Now, so what were some of the key findings? So unlike what the coalition said, clearly there were hundreds of civilians still living in the building. Many had no ties to ISIS at all. Some were families of ISIS members, but again, just being an ISIS family member does not make you a legitimate target. One of the local notables who used to pass by driving the school, he said that he did see at times, I mean, so I'm giving you sort of our full transparent account of what we found, that he did see at times ISIS fighters driving in and out of the building, or sometimes sitting as a small group near the entrance in the evening. Based on his information, these were basically the men who had families staying in that, right? There were some ISIS-affiliated families, so they would come and visit their families, and when they would, you know, they might be sitting outside and chatting. He said that he had heard, though he had not seen, that ISIS, as is common, had set up inside the school compound, in one place, had set up a Sharia course, which is also common. Anyone who's worked on ISIS-held areas, they do that as it's mandatory in all areas they control, that they do these sort of Sharia courses trying to train. It's not a military training, it's basically their interpretation of what Islam is, and it's mandatory for people to attend. By pure luck, on that visit, we also managed to interview a Syrian man who had joined ISIS and who was in prison. We were visiting a prison to check on conditions of detention, and he mentioned that he himself at one point had his family that had you know, moved to the school. He had been lucky because he had a cousin who didn't live very far, and they had moved out of the school before the strike. There's also some local witnesses that reported, as I mentioned, the school is actually not in Mansoura. It's on one of the main roads that drive south. On that road, basically took you to another front line. That they have seen at some point ISIS fighters driving with jeeps and potentially anti-aircraft guns on that road. But that didn't mean that they actually, there's no indication at any point, based on all the witnesses we spoke to, that this was in any way an ISIS base. And I'll mention one detail because I think it becomes relevant as well in terms of Germany's role and the photographs and what could have been seen or not. One of the survivors, who was an 11-year-old child, she said that children used to play in the school's courtyard. So, you know, if we believe that testimony, and there's no reason not to believe it, any sort of monitoring from the sky that the coalition says they do should have, at some point, shown that there is civilian activity in that school. Now, the victims, how many people died in that strike? I should just start by saying investigating these sorts of strikes are very, very difficult, particularly when the strike affects a building that hosts displaced people. Okay, not everyone knows everyone's name, and in this case, most people actually died. And when we got there, it was very hard to find families from everyone. We were able to establish by name, which we actually published, 40 victims. Okay, now, we make that very clear in the report, because I think the coalition then just used that number. We make that very clear in the report that this is not our estimate of the number of casualties, but these are the ones that we were able to establish by name because we were able to find family members and survivors. Okay, and of those 40, there were 15 women and 16 children. We were taken, and you see it, it's in the behind photo, from one of the first responders where they took some of the bodies and buried them. It is very hard to know the names of all the casualties because you had, first of all, Syrians and Iraqis, potentially some other nationalities as well. You had people who didn't necessarily know each other. And you also had the fact that when the strike happened, ISIS did not allow locals to record the names of the victims. We actually even went to the hospital. So the ones who were wounded but could have survived were taken to the Tabqa hospital. And we went to the Tabqa hospital to see if we can find any records. In July, the Tabqa hospital had been retaken by the coalition and the SDF from ISIS, except before pulling out, ISIS had destroyed all records. So there are no records at the Tabqa hospital of how many wounded were taken that night. There are a couple of smaller clinics in Tabqa that took some victims, and we managed to get some numbers from them. The UN Commission of Inquiry, and I'm sure James will talk about it, their report came afterwards, and they managed to put the death toll at 150. Again, that number is very logical to me, given given how many people were living in the building, and given the scale of destruction that night. So maybe the next slide. So what did the coalition say? So immediately after the strike, the coalition maintained the position that this was an ISIS intelligence headquarters, not any building, headquarters, and that there was a weapon storage facility, and that there were more than 30 ISIS militants that typically stayed there. And that they also said that they had observed the target on multiple occasions to assess what in coalition speak they talk about as pattern of life. So this is when they do monitoring from the air to sort of determine, are there civilians here? Do people come out? Is it better to strike in the evening or during the day? Because basically when they struck, everyone was sleeping. They actually struck at the absolute worst moment, given what that school was being used, which was, by IDPs and people who are displaced. And that they actually used the right size and the right fusing of the ammunition to minimize potential harm to transient individuals. I mean, that's also their language, transient individuals, because they maintain the position there are no civilians in the building. So we're mostly concerned about someone driving on that road next to the school. So we used, basically, I think they used weapons to implode the building completely. I mean, they just flattened it completely. And now, immediately after, I think it was end of March, there was a hearing here, and the German media outlets, a hearing at the German parliament, and media outlets basically said that German forces flanked tornado jets took pictures of the building a day before the airstrike and shared them with coalition partners. And the German media also report that Germany flew a follow-up mission to assess the impact of the strikes. And there was a meeting on March 29th, so basically a week after the strike, where the German military inspector briefed Parliament's Defense Committee. I'm not an expert on what happens in Germany, and I think this will be the subject of the second discussion. In July 2017, so actually as I was entering the area, the coalition issued another report. They issue that every month. It's called the Monthly Civilian Casualty Report. And they basically said, we've reviewed all available information and the strike video that was taken, and there's insufficient evidence to find that civilians were harmed in the strike. Okay, so they maintained that position for 3 months. We do our investigation, we write them, we don't get an answer, we go public with our finding, and finally, after multiple correspondence, in June 2018, they finally say, okay, we reopened the investigation, and yes, civilians died. Okay, they say, but the way, and this is the phrase they use, so, you know, they got the new evidence, they reopened it, which is okay, we're happy that they reopened it. But then they say during a strike on Daesh, now they're not using intelligence, militant multifunctional center. Again, I'm not sure what a militant multifunctional center actually means, or that it's actually a military term, and that it allegedly caused civilian casualties. And then they say 40 civilians were unintentionally killed. Now, they don't say where they got that 40. I suspect they just took our number, except in our report we say at least 40, and the number is probably much higher. And here, you know, the at least was pulled out. It just says 40 civilians. If you go to the next slide, please. So and now I'll just stop there to give a chance to colleagues to talk more about it. But what are the open issues of this strike, and what does it tell us? First of all, you know, what were the precautions taken by the coalition before they undertook the strike, right? Because this is really the heart of the matter if we don't want to see the situation repeat itself, and unfortunately it did repeat itself multiple times in Raqqa, in Deir ez-Zor, and many other areas. Did the coalition take all feasible precautions, which is what international law requires them to, and this is what they tell us they are doing? They say we're taking all feasible precautions. And that leaves us, for me, in two situations, and I'm trying to be very much in good faith engaging with them. Now, if they fail to detect the presence of hundreds of civilians, because we know for a fact that there were hundreds of civilians in that school, then I'm actually very worried about their aptitude and how they are going about ascertaining if there are civilians or not, right? And because if they monitored that building for some time, or if they had interviewed any human intel source from the area, they would have told them that this school is being used as a center for IDP since at least 2012. It was an open secret. I mean, no one was hiding it. And if they knew that, you know, I mean, what kind of assumptions are they making? Are they making an assumption, well, ISIS families arrived here, hence we're going to consider them to be militants and a legitimate target? So I think it raised a lot of questions about how they go about assessing their precautions. Two, it also raised a lot of questions, frankly, about their investigations. About their initial investigation or reporting between March to July 2017, which made them say in July 2017, no civilian killed, it was intelligence headquarters. And then, you know, a year later, saying, okay, oops, we got it wrong the first time. There were 40 civilians that were killed, except we gave them the names of witnesses on the ground. We gave them the names of survivors, two of whom are actually now in Lebanon. They never bothered to talk to them. They never bothered to call them, even though the US actually operates in the entire area, so it was very easy for them to determine. So they never told us how they conducted the investigation, and if they tried to learn the lessons. But three, and maybe the most important point, is they failed to address the victims. Their only sentence is, oops, unintentionally we may have killed 40 civilians. But to this day, there's still no procedure to communicate with the victims. There's no procedure to actually provide compensation payments to the victims. Two of the survivors that we remained in touch with, we actually sent official letters to the US asking for compensation in their name. We said they are present in Lebanon, they are ready to meet with US officials. They're actually economically in a very difficult situation. They're orphans now, they're living with their aunt in Lebanon, who herself is a refugee with very limited means. To this day, there is no answer. A lot of expressions of sympathy, but nothing concrete. And the last point I want to raise, which is an issue here, but is also an issue that we are seeing in so many strikes today in these areas, is the dilution of responsibility between allies. Okay, so maybe Germany provided the imagery the day before. We don't know how they allocated the strikes between themselves. We actually believe it was the Americans that took the strike, but actually they all hide behind each other. It's all the coalition, except the coalition, ultimately they say, well, each country has its own military procedures and its own investigation. So it's very, very hard to pin down responsibility. This is one concrete example, and I'm very happy to have the chance to talk about this today in Germany, because, Germany should be playing a much more active role in investigating, in setting up the facts, in explaining what precautions were taken. But this is unfortunately an issue that we have seen in so many strikes in the anti-ISIS coalition. Thank you very much.
I would just, what you were saying sparked a question for me, and is just a very brief follow-up question. Why did you start the investigation in the first place? So what was the source of information that made you think we need to go on the ground and check?
So there were local Syrian groups that had mentioned, we actually had a list of a number of strikes that we wanted to investigate. And the reason why we rushed in July at the time was not because I like to be in northeast Syria in July. It's terribly hot. It was 42 degrees working out there. But because this was before the big battle for Raqqa city. And we thought, okay, we're seeing what happened in Tabqa. If we can investigate those and flag concerns, maybe they can change the way they take their precautions for the strikes in Raqqa. And I have to say we failed. Okay, I mean, we did go in, we did produce the report, we did try to do advocacy with the coalition. There's no indication that they changed anything in the way they waged the ongoing strikes on Raqqa and other places. But yeah, I mean, like most things in Syria, there are local networks. When ISIS was there, the information was limited. As they left, there were a couple of local groups that had sort of raised the alarm, and that there were also some, like in most areas of Syria, local sort of community Facebook groups that had posted it.
And I'm looking forward to discussing after precisely this thing that you mentioned, which is how dilution of information can mean dilution of responsibility. So I now turn to Fadel. So the Syrian Network on Human Rights is one of the most credible organizations operating on the ground. Could you tell us more about the situation on your side? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation. And thank you for Nadim. And I come to know that you're going to highlight in details this incident. So I'm going to move to give a picture of a widespread picture about the coalition intervention in Syria. So if we just first of all move to the first chart, this is now the main perpetrator actually in Syria, and here we can see the percentage of the coalition, 1.36 from the total casualties. That's based on our database, which we cumulatively work on since establishment of SNHR. So about 3,035 civilians have been killed by the international coalition. And I remember the first day of the international coalition interfere in Syria in 23rd of September 2014. There were actually several targets. One of them take place in Kafr Drayan village in south of Idlib, and that's lead to 12 casualties, including 5 children and 5 ladies. So from the first day there is like casualties lost. So what's the distinguish between our work and other like international organization or even the Commission of Inquiry? That we are local national organizations who keep following those incidents. And we build database for the violation of the international coalition. Then we analyzed this database. And so what we found, and at the early stage of the intervention of the coalition, we spoke with the U.S. government, and we are then their main source, by the way, of the DRL. You can see their reports about human rights violation in Syria, which is launched past week. We are coming always second source after the commission of after the commission of inquiry by quoting. So we go through and we discuss those incidents in order to avoid the distortion of their global aim, global goal, which is defeated ISIS. We don't want to deny that this is very noble goal, and get rid out of ISIS, and that's helping too much the Syrian society. And that's also one goal of the Syrian uprising, to defeat the extremist group Al-Nusra and ISIS. So such types of incident will distort that goal. So if I may move to my next slide. Based on our database, as I mentioned, we keep following small incident, not big one like Al-Mansura or Umar ibn al-Khattab Mosque, by the way, which is also investigated by the Commission of Inquiry. So we noticed several points. First point, this is this chart showing how distribution of the casualties based on year. So the start point September 2014. So the second year September 2015 and going on. So instead of like improvement and minimize the casualties, here we notice that the casualties increased. So that's mean there is no lesson learnings from the mistakes, unfortunately. The first year was amazing, actually, comparing with others. But in the disaster is in 2016, between 2016 and 2018. If I may to move to the next chart, this is the distribution of ISIS control area based on the area which is seized. Here we notice that in 2015 the ISIS is expand. In 2015, in 2016 the ISIS is a shrink, but it is still seizing more territory than in 2014. If I may move to the next slide, please. Here we distribute the massacres which is taking place on the international coalition hand. We are able to document 172 massacres. So 5 persons and above killed in one attacks. We noticed that Al-Raqqa is coming first, then by 99 massacres, then Deir ez-Zor in 42. Please move to the next chart. Here the vital civilians facilities, 181, including mosques, schools, hospitals. That's a very high level figures, actually, through those year. Please move to the next one. See, 25 hospitals, 16 schools, 4 markets. That's a very high level of attacks. So my next point, please move to the next chart. Here we compare between 2 administrations, also between President Obama administration, what was the situation. Then in President Trump administration, we noticed that there is reckless actually in the attacks, which is lead for high level of casualties. We keep actually following what is the report which is published by the International Coalition, which is about 27 reports, monthly reports. We keep reviewing and comparing between what's the International Coalition announced, and they announce 1,275 casualties in each Syria, in both Iraq and Syria, which is so far from what we are able to, what we recorded in our database. And that's also part of my discussion. I came recently, like 2 weeks ago from DC, and I met with the DOD, and we offered them actually to types of cooperation in order to avoid any like further oval attacks. And that I'm gonna to maybe to speak later on about this. So comparison, if you please move to the next one. Comparison is always useful. So this is also based on our database. This is the first time the international coalition kill more civilians than the Russian forces. So that's always important to make these types of comparison. The final point that only the US, the United States, is the only one who keep reporting actually, keep issuing report. No other state from the coalition is issuing a report, which is very strange actually, and this something need to be changed. And as Nadim mentioned, it's so difficult to know which country actually committed this violation. France, German, so it's very we don't know in our organization. I don't know maybe Airways or others if they know exactly which country. I think it's so difficult to know that. And also, as Nadim mentioned, there is no mechanism, no clear methodology, and there is no clear also review how there is no clear methodology, and there is no clear how they reviewing their mistakes, which is now very repeated, widespread, which is amount to be war crimes. Here I'm gonna to stop. I don't want to take much, and I hope that when we open the discussion.
Just a quick follow-up question. Thank you. You mentioned the fact that these incidents defeat the point of fighting ISIS and Al-Nusra. Why is that?
That's also discussion and debate keep and I'm very much appreciated that we have such types of panel, because we keep getting reports from the Syrian and from the local media about the violation committed by the international coalition. Is there types of accountability for them? That's very important question, and that's the main aim of such type of event actually, that the accountability will follow anyone who committed violation in Syria, regardless if international coalition or Russian forces or anyone. So that's the point actually, and the reckless actually and the repeated incident which lead to lost casualties and which is destroy lots of vital center, and finally the stability in the area, which is still not exist till this moment. Actually, that's also send a very wrong message, and this is also part of the discussion that the area now is handled or still handled with the SDF. SDF is mainly PYD forces, and the local council is not elected democratically. so that and there is nothing prevent actually start redressing, start reparation in northeast Syria, and start also doing democratic election, which is lead to local council, democratically elected, and this under this local council there is forces following. Now the local council is totally under the SDF forces. So all of that, of course, distorts the noble goal of defeated ISIS.
Yeah, you gave us a head start on the recommendations, and I would really like it if James could elaborate on the work of the UN Commissioner of Inquiry on Syria, and perhaps maybe give a few key recommendations that you have drafted with the Commission. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I just thought I would start just by talking a little bit about our investigation and the findings we were able to come up with, and also just say a little bit about how we were able to conduct an investigation. Given the fact that we don't have access to Syria, that we conduct necessarily all of our investigations remotely, and given that in this particular instance we faced a lot of challenges and limitations that made this particular investigation extremely difficult for us, and it took a very long time for us to complete our investigation to the point where we had reached the findings that you found in our report of March 2018. I'd just start just by saying, but why did we faced so many challenges, and why did we stick with this particular investigation? I would say that we started the investigation almost immediately after it appearing in the media, and also after reading some of the accounts from Syrian Observatory and from other civil society groups. And I mean, it's really, there's a key reason why we undertook this investigation, because one, it fits squarely into the priorities that we have as a commission. We have for a long time prioritized investigating attacks against protected locations, including schools. We had been very disturbed that there had been increasing reports of airstrikes on IDP camps. And of course, perhaps the biggest picture reason is that the irresponsible use of air power is, other than the mass violations committed in places of detention, the irresponsible use of air power in this conflict is probably the second most defining violation of human rights and IHL that you could find in the conflict so far, at least in my opinion. Now, I think I'm almost contractually bound to start just by saying a few things about how the Commission of Inquiry works, and the way that we work is slightly different from others, in part because we are a body mandated by the UN Human Rights Council with sort of a tripartite mandate to investigate all human rights violations occurring in the conflict. Tall task there. We have to establish facts and circumstances surrounding those violations, and wherever possible to attribute responsibility for purposes of supporting future accountability for those violations and international crimes, particularly those that amount to crimes against humanity. And we also have a specific burden to report our findings publicly, which is an extremely important part of the mandate, and something that I think sets us apart from at least some organizations and commissions that work on particularly difficult conflicts. Our methodology is essentially, the methodology that we use is, I guess you'd say, international best practices, particularly in situations where the mechanism does not have access to the territory where the violation occurred. or the violations in our case, occurred. And what we do is we ensure that all of our investigations are grounded first and foremost in the testimony of primary sources. So interviews with victims and eyewitnesses to the violation itself. Wherever possible, we have to corroborate every detail of those testimonies that we intend to use or that we rely upon for findings or to establish facts and circumstances through, again, relying on primary sources, which means effectively getting people doing long-form interviews with victims and getting multiple victims and witnesses to tell their stories so that we can corroborate in detail what they experienced, to see areas of agreement, disagreement, areas where their stories changed or did not change, consistency, inconsistency, so that we can tease out legal findings. And why that matters is that we have to adhere necessarily to a legal standard of proof on not only on the legal findings themselves, but also the detail to which we describe the facts and circumstances of how the violation occurred. Our legal standard of proof is a reasonable grounds to believe, which we essentially, to use, I guess, just a very generic term, we say that that is anywhere from 51% to 60 to 65% certainty that the way we have described an incident is indeed how it actually occurred. The last point on methodology I'd make is that whereas we realize that many other organizations have extremely good information, we can't rely upon that for our findings. We have to rely only on information we've collected ourselves. And that way we can also verify how the information was collected and how it was corroborated. Now, as I was saying, this particular investigation presented a lot of challenges to us, in particular because we, again, have no access to the country, let alone to the site of the violation. There was an extreme difficulty in finding survivors to this attack, to these airstrikes. And that's for the simple reason of not many people survived. And many of the people who did survive, as Nadim already described, were severely injured. And for at least for an extended period after the attack, ISIS was preventing many people from leaving the area. They were preventing people from using telephones. They were preventing people from, so the telephones are important because since we don't have access to the country when an incident like that happens, we do try to call into the country to speak directly to victims, witnesses, first responders, humanitarians, or others who may have been witnesses to the attack or to the aftermath of an attack or of a violation. So the fact that people either were not secure in using their telephones or were not allowed to made a big difference to us, because then we lacked that sort of direct link to eyewitnesses. And then, of course, as Nadim also mentioned, ISIS was essentially threatening people, keeping them from documenting the number of people killed, preventing them from taking photos in and around the site of the explosion. Now, we discovered soon after that there were some people that were able to take photos, and luckily we were able to obtain those photos directly from the people who took them. And this leads me, I guess, to the biggest point about the way we overcame this limitation. We overcame this limitation, frankly, just by solid relationships that we have developed over the years with the extremely brave and capable civil society groups operating inside Syria, with humanitarians and first responders, particularly the people who helped get survivors outside of Syria for medical treatment. They helped us locate individuals that were willing to be interviewed by our people, either directly in person or remotely by telephone. It was particularly important with the children that we were also able to make contact with relatives and guardians who were able to help us in conducting an interview of sorts with many children. As Nadim's very helpful graphic, I feel very embarrassed I don't have a PowerPoint, but much like my commission, I am technologically challenged because the UN, while generous in some ways, is miserable with information technology. Essentially, the interviews that we were able to do 20 interviews with 20 different first-hand or primary sources overall. As the graphic that was up from Nadim, we did have access to 12 survivors of the attack, and I do say survivors and victims both because the vast majority of these people had really terrible, suffered terrible injuries. But we were also able to speak to 8 others, and these were either people who were first responders on the scene, rescue workers who tried to help get either survivors or bodies out of the rubble of the structure, and also some local villagers who were very familiar with the area, that were at the site, who were doing a variety of things even if they were not digging survivors out of the rubble, but they were witnesses to at least part of what happened. Our investigation really focused around answering certain key questions, such as, what was the nature of the building that was hit, who was operating out of it, in particular, was ISIS present at the building, how many civilians lived there, and of course, how many individuals were killed through the attack. We were helped out on the attribution side by the fact the international coalition took responsibility for the airstrikes. So that helped at least one piece of our puzzle, and then also helped us put other pieces in place as we got these detailed interviews, again, over a space of about 6 or 7 months, and then also got other sources like photographs, satellite imagery, a few other sources that I'm quite possibly my legal advisor would be smacking me right now if I talked about. But what struck us were many of the same points that Nadim mentioned early on. That one, the building, a multi-story building intended to be able to board students as a school was, it was not in question. It was widely known. The fact that facility was then transformed into an IDP camp in 2012 to accommodate individuals from Palmyra, Al-Baba, and other locations, that was very well known. The fact that the building was capable of accommodating hundreds of individuals, and that IDPs were moved into those facilities was apparent. And then we get into the attack itself. And what struck us from the testimonies we received, and also from the photos and other evidence that we were able to get a hold of, it struck us first of all that there was a series of airstrikes, 3 airstrikes that took place, from a variety of the first-hand accounts, the number of sequences of explosions that were heard and so forth. That through viewing images of the building, there were very clear impact points that were clearly marking an airborne munition. And then, of course, the photos that show these multiple impact points, there were multiple photos that we received of the remnants of Hellfire missiles, in particularly those that had been modified with delayed fuse capability, which, of course, those sorts of weapons are used to bring down structures. The delayed fuse is meant to delay the point of detonation so that the foundation of the building is most affected, which then leads to the collapse of the structure. Clearly, from the images you saw, they were very successful in achieving that effect. And then, of course, the other thing was the large number of civilians killed, either by the blast of the weaponry or by the collapse of the building itself onto them. There were several individuals out of the 12 survivors that we spoke to. Several of them indicated that they woke up having been blown out of the building. So the concussive impact of the blast actually, jettisoned them from the building structure, and that is how they survived. Oftentimes with either horrible burns, a great deal of shrapnel from rubble or other impacts. In terms of our findings and how all of these different points added up to the legal findings we made in the report, there were some key variances with other reports at the time. First of all, the vast majority of the people we spoke to said that ISIS was not present at the time of the attack in the building. We had some individuals that said that ISIS had been present in previous months, in particular family members, but that the last family members had left about a month before this airstrike. In the end, we were not able to corroborate that, so it did not enter into our facts and circumstances or legal findings. But other than a few, we had one witness who said that ISIS would frequently come with a pickup truck that was mounted with various weaponry, and that would do patrols around the school. That was the only indication we had of a military presence at any period close to the time of the airstrike. So in the end, we focused also, again, on this question of how many civilians then were killed. We felt that we had established at least the clear evidence of civilian, the fact that civilians were there in large numbers. Most of the estimates that we received from many of the either relatives of individuals who were living in the facility or from the survivors themselves, it was right around 200 people, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less at the time of the attack, but 200 was the number. In terms of the number of casualties, this is something we labored over a long time. We talked to people, tried to get them to, particularly the individuals who were responsible for pulling people out of the rubble, how many bodies they successfully got out of the rubble. And we tried to cross-check figures and everything else. In the end, we settled on a number of around 150. In many cases, we were able to put names that people recollected of individuals they saw or the bodies they identified, but 150 was in the end with the number that we felt most secure in reporting that we had proven. So finally, the findings that we were able to come up with were that the building, of course, was a school, and its long-term nature and use as an IDP camp was something that was well known by people throughout the area. That it was occupied by civilians. Of course, we found that there was no ISIS presence at the time of the attack. And as a result of these factors, our finding was that the international community should have known the nature and use of this building. They should have known that civilians were present, and as a result, they failed to take all feasible precautions to prevent injury or loss of civilian life or damage to a civilian structure. And that, of course, is a violation of international humanitarian law. We also, because we did follow the discussions within both the, I guess you'd say, the the comments being made publicly by the Combined Joint Task Force spokesperson and by the International Coalition, by CENTCOM and others. There were different blogs and so forth where different legal advisors were making comments. And so we did add a finding, particularly following their investigation, that the International Coalition's resulting investigation also should have been able to identify the presence of civilians and the high numbers of civilians killed. That is something that their investigation absolutely should reveal. And what that told us, at least, is that one of the, I guess, the key problems with the investigations they're undertaking is that they are not speaking to people on the ground, most likely. And I think that actually the investigation that the Commission personnel undertook is a clear sign of what you can find when you are speaking to people directly on the ground. Human Rights Watch's report is also clear evidence of that. Whenever you go in and you actually speak to people, you can find out a lot of different information that is critical to saving civilian lives. You can't just rely on aerial footage if you're going to protect the civilian population. So yeah, I guess that's all I should say at the moment. I've probably said way too much.
James, just one question on the spot. After the publication of the Commission report, there was no reaction from anyone? Was there any back and forth? Was there a reply of some sort from coalition, obviously?
Not officially. There was no official response. Some of the blogs and things went crazy, but we never got an official response to our report.
And then I would just, before welcoming the second panel of speakers, I would just like to ask to all of you about the SDF behavior in all of this. I mean, Nadim mentioned earlier that some of the hospital records were destroyed by ISIS. Ah, right, okay. So after ISIS was kicked out, what was the behavior of the SDF with regards to your investigation?
Here we have 2 points. First point that not only the international coalition like attacks led by air forces, there is attacks also by artillery attack. Yeah, and those joint attack and there is officer by the international coalition beside the SDF forces. So there is artillery attack taking place on the ground, and those attacks lead to civilian casualties as well. The second one, SDF is the main provider of the intelligence of the international coalition air forces attacks. So that's lead us about the repeated violation taking place. So we blame the intelligence on the ground as well. So how this cooperation? There is no real methodology. How's those report from the international coalition? What's their methodology? So the role of SDF, but based on what what the society there told us or informed us, that they get threatened from SDF several times if you didn't evacuate your building. So we're gonna to provide your home coordination to the international coalition. So we get negative actually impact from SDF plus their engagement in different types of violation through the artillery attack and through the intelligence as well. So there is this here two elements.
So it's something I rarely do at Human Rights Watch, but I'll start with the positives. I have to say, Northeast Syria today is the only part of Syria where we can operate, I would say, quite freely. No one interfered in our investigation. We've asked to visit prisons, and that has, I have to say, I go to Northeast Syria every 3 months, and I'm allowed to work without being harassed. And I want to acknowledge that, because today this is a rarity in Syria. On the specifics, so I want to talk about two different things. On the specifics of Mansoura, so the coalition does two types of airstrikes. One, what they call dynamic, and one, these sort of more like deliberative static attacks. This Mansoura attack is a planned attack, right? So they put a bank of targets. It's not in the heat of the battle. They got a call from the ground, go attack that. They have a list of targets. As I mentioned, the context here is the trying to retake Tabqa. They intensify the strikes on anything they believe is ISIS related, and they draw up the database. In these strikes, and I agree with sort of Fadl, who is giving the intel to the coalition? How much of the intel is human intel? How much of the intel is basically just eyes in the sky? I honestly don't know about Mansoura school, who was doing what. I mean, and this is what the investigation should have shown, and whether the SDF had sufficiently good intel on that part. I honestly don't know. So I cannot tell you on this particular strike the sort of SDF behavior, whether it impacted or not. On the second sort of strikes, the sort of dynamic strikes, by that I mean you're in Raqqa, you're advancing, you see an ISIS sniper, you call in the strike. You know, this is usually done by the SDF. You know, is there an intermediary by the coalition or not? There are different, you know, depending on which battle, you get different people. You know, they have some special forces in some battles. One thing is clear, and this was a clear decision taken by the coalition. You know, the default has been you strike. So I have seen streets in Raqqa, and I actually happened to have visited Raqqa after the regime, before ISIS, so for a few months. So I knew Raqqa before it was destroyed, and I've revisited Raqqa after it was destroyed. And so they were basically, an ISIS sniper would come up on top of a building, hitting, someone from the ground calls it in. By the time they hit the building, the sniper would have run through, usually, you know, they break walls into another building. They call in the second strike. So you have entire streets, you know, one building after the next. And this is really the heart of the matter today, what you're talking about, the air, the way we're waging wars today, not we, the way wars are being waged, high technology in the air, they want zero casualties. It basically means maximum destruction on the ground. We can talk later about SDF violations on the ground. You know, there have been cases of theft and so forth. You know, I think there's a lot to talk about. It's a different distraction. But again, I have found, I mean, we've documented a lot of issues. They've used child soldiers. Again, the cup is either half empty or half full. When we've really raised hell with them over this issue, they finally demobilized people. You know, they're somehow influenceable on some issues, but of course they've committed abuses as well.
I was actually just thinking more about the official responses that we have gotten, and I even though it wasn't an official response to us, I think that the one thing the coalition did do after we published our report was say that they were going to reopen the investigation based on information given to them by Human Rights Watch. So you know, maybe that's where they liked your numbers better than ours, but no, for us, it's kind of tricky. I think that all of these issues of, you know, the responses we get and the willingness of different actors to consider, you know, the elements or recommendations for how violations can be mitigated or how they can improve their own behavior is kind of tricky, particularly in Syria. I will say that SDF have been open to dialogue in the past, and at times they have changed their behavior, or at least, you know, issued, you know, encouraging documents about, you know, their conduct and their refusal to recruit child soldiers, even though they do go back to it and so forth, as we've documented. But this is actually, again, one of the big frustrations of this conflict is that no one seems willing to have a sort of regular, normal discussion about IHL and about human rights norms and standards. And again, this is something I always get in trouble with, because I always want to compare the war in Syria to the war in Afghanistan, because I was in Afghanistan for a number of years, and what struck me was that even the Taliban was willing to have a discussion about IHL and about civilian protection, and yet no one seems to be interested in doing that here in Syria, and that's one of the reasons why it's in the situation it's in, and yeah, it's catastrophic.
In general, the whole legal discussion is always extremely complicated, and whenever the law is brought forward, especially with military officials, that's when the most complex dialogue occurs, I find, in Europe as well. I mean, one thing I didn't mention earlier is that there are televisions, so we're on TV. So I think it would be very interesting now to have perhaps a more European-focused perspective, and also a perspective more engaged on the legal and transparency aspects of such incidents. And I would like to welcome on stage so Andreas Scholler from the ECCHR. Would you like to join us? Yeah. And Maaike Auwaerter, who is Advocacy Officer and Conflict Researcher for Air Wars. Andreas is the Director of the International Crimes and Accountability Program at ECCHR. And Robert Frau from the University of Potsdam and European University Viadrina. So I believe what was mentioned earlier, this whole discussion about assistance in these strikes and what it means for coalition forces whenever another state is implicated. So Germany, of course, is topical in this conversation, and I would like to hear a bit more in Germany. But before we do this, I think it'd be interesting to hear more on the work of Air Wars and the European perspective that Maaike has as she operates out of the Netherlands.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. Maybe just a little bit about Air Wars. So we monitor and assess civilian harm allegations from air and artillery strikes by international military actions in Iraq, Syria, and Libya. And we also monitor and archive military claims from those from the belligerents. So the US-led coalition, individual allies, Russia, Turkey, the Syrian regime, and we cross-check those claims with our public record. Through our findings, we sort of advocate on behalf of affected civilians and ultimately seek transparency and accountability from belligerents to, in the end, mitigate civilian harm in future conflict. And we use a broad range of sources, mostly local Arab language sources, both traditional media but also social media sources, and we monitor those sources on a daily basis. Through that practice, we sort of get a good understanding of which sources are more credible and which sources are maybe less credible, and we make an assessment on those civilian harm allegations through triangulation of information. And I think what we've seen through our work is that today, through the use of modern technologies such as smartphone technology, social media, civilians in conflict are actually much better able to communicate what is happening on the ground. But that also leads to sort of visible disparity between what civilians are saying and are reporting about civilian harm on the battlefields and what belligerents are saying. So what militaries are saying and reporting in terms of civilian harm. And, as an example, so the US-led coalition has conceded to about 1,200 civilian deaths over the course of the war, and that is a sharp sharp contrast with what we've actually found, the 7,500 civilian deaths that local monitors reported in Iraq and Syria, and that we assessed as likely, but that's according to our most conservative estimate. So those numbers might actually be higher, and we use a grading system to do these assessments. So we would assess an incident as confirmed when a belligerent would have actually taken responsibility for the incident, and we would assess an incident as fair or likely when there's 2 or more credible sources that reported on the incident, usually with photo and videographic material, and when we've also found strikes that were reported by the belligerents themselves that were actually in the near vicinity of the location that locals reported on. And I think, you know, what is interesting here in this strike that we're discussing today, we actually found really early on that this was a huge civilian casualty event, because we had a large number of sources that reported, you know, large numbers of civilian casualties from this airstrike. And, you know, we had lots of photo and videographic material as well. And so we were in contact with the civilian casualty cell of the coalition right from the start, and we were in contact with their military lawyers, and it actually looked like they were going to make a decision on this. But then, you know, General Townsend actually came out with a public statement in a press conference and you know, stated that there was no civilian harm in this incident, which put the civilian casualty cell in a really difficult position. And then it took 18 months for the coalition to actually take action on this and take responsibility for the incident, after an on-the-ground investigation by, you know, Human Rights Watch and the UN, whereas it should have conducted this on-the-ground investigation itself. And I think from the 270 incidents that the US-led coalition has, that, you know, involved civilian harm that the US-led coalition has conceded to, actually only 1 incident was investigated on the ground, which is shocking in my perspective, and I think many people here will agree. So I'm really glad to be here today to discuss with all of you, you know, how this can be prevented in the future. I think maybe one more thing, you know, it was discussed by others here already, but, you know, making an assessment of civilian harm through or based predominantly on aerial observations just has so many limitations, because I think in this conflict we've seen that a lot of the battles actually occurred in urban environments, and you simply just cannot see, based on an image from an aircraft, whether there are civilians that are hiding in the basement, or after the strike, whether there's, you know, bodies that are still stuck under the rubble. And so it's extremely important that the US-led coalition, but other belligerents as well, take external sources seriously in their investigation and listen to what local communities are reporting on, and not only, you know, alter those numbers, but also identify the victims of these airstrikes, and what was mentioned earlier as well, go talk to them and follow up with them and compensate them for their loss. Even if the strike was conducted within the IHL framework, it's still incredibly important and a significant step towards reparation and reconstruction, that victims of airstrikes are compensated for the losses that they've suffered. So I think, I think I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Micah. One question that I kept thinking of while listening to you all on this, before we get into the legal part, is, in your experience, and you have a lot of experience on this, what works? I mean, what strategy can you apply? And I know that if we had the exact answer to this, then we would get transparency whenever we wanted. But in your experience, what has worked in the past? And I'm asking all of you, and of course there was as well, when do we get governments to admit to their deeds? What can we do to get more information, basically?
I think maybe I'll add one more thing before I hand over the mic to somebody else. So I think we do have good practice examples. I think one in particular is worth mentioning here because actually 10 days after this strike occurred, another strike occurred by the US-led coalition that killed seven civilians, and Australia was actually the one that reported that they were responsible for the intelligence that led to the airstrike, that they, similar to Germany, actually brought forth these images. And they self-reported this, they investigated the incident, they took responsibility, and they published the information just for the public to see. So I think that is actually a good practice example of what transparency looks like. And I think countries such as Germany that do have a role to play need to take this example and follow this example, because that's really important. And Australia did this in 4 other cases as well. So, not all hope is lost, but definitely there should be more individual allies that follow that example as well.
I think for me there's sort of two levels where the discussion can happen. I mean, one of the challenges, particularly in relation to the anti-ISIS coalition, is general public indifference, right? I mean, there's this idea, it's as if Raqqa is a city empty of civilians and it doesn't matter the cost, you just have to defeat ISIS the fastest way possible. So from terms of, I am convinced if it wasn't Raqqa, I mean, public opinion would have reacted when they saw the destruction if it was any city outside of sort of the ISIS context. But because it was ISIS, there was a general indifference. It was just like, good riddance. I mean, Raqqa almost became completely, and you have that in a number of conflicts. Gaza is one of them. There's a general public indifference about it. And so I think that's the challenge, and that's really about creating a public opinion that can push, and that also means journalists who actually get their editors to commission pieces on the stories of these civilians. Because one of the reasons we actually published the 40 names, even that we knew full well that there were a lot more than 40, is we wanted to give these victims a name and a face again. We did that on purpose. So in the absence of public discussion, you end up with these sort of private advocacy. You're trying to convince. And I'm of the view, I mean, no pilot, in the Western coalition, or even I think in Russia, goes out in the morning and says, I'm going to kill myself 40 civilians or 150 civilians that day, right? But the issue is, can you convince them that they made that mistake? I mean, that's been the barrier for so long on this. They are, I mean, when they talk, it's like, no, you're lying. It's like, no, I'm not lying because I've been there. You just, and what is the level of evidence that you can gather to get over that threshold and to create enough allies within their system? If we're not talking about the sort of public advocacy pressure, but internally, to find allies internally that are going to push for that. And I think that's very important. Courts have a really important role to play, and I think strategic litigation, Freedom of Information Acts to try to collect that information. And then frankly, I mean, what we have to recognize is sheer luck. Sometimes some strikes move the needle, and there's a story and there's a victim that you can put a face to that story, and somehow people feel moved by it. I mean, just in the report that we documented the Al-Mansoura strike, I talked about the strike on the Tabqa market, which was also very, very deadly in similar circumstances. In the middle of the day, dozens and dozens of civilians died. No one wrote about it. And the coalition felt no pressure to reopen the investigation. We have the same amount of data on that strike. Actually, we even have probably, more witnesses that we gave them. Didn't care about it.
Yeah. Actually, I think that keep highlighting the violation is very important. And that's also pressuring the international coalition. Advocating and meeting level, I'm speaking about SNHR, we keep requesting meetings since the beginning with the DOD. And they ignore our request several times. Recently they accepted, and we need to show that we are types of advisor in order to avoid. We don't want like only to criticize. We need those violations not to be repeated. That's our aim actually. So in order to achieve that, it's required type of cooperation, high-level cooperation, to open investigation and to admit. This is the first step, to admit actually the mistake. And as a Syrian organization, and our investigator team, they are from the province itself, so we have high level of reach to the people. So we keep gathering those small incidents to build that database, and we are able to share those database with international organization, with the UN, with the DOD, in order to eliminate the mistakes.
Okay.
I mean, I'll be very, very brief because I know you have more people to get to, but I would just say that, to my mind, there has to be a stake in the fight to make the governments actually pay attention, and whether that be trying as much as possible to publish reports that include as much evidence and data as possible without endangering information sources. That's one part of it. The second part of it is doing things like what ECCHR is doing in terms of taking governments to court, making them live up to their legal obligations, because in the end, it is a matter of law and legal obligation that makes a lot of governments pay attention. That's one of the reasons why so many states have stopped publicly reporting on the civilian casualties they caused, because they don't want to be taken to court. And and I would agree that there are other things militaries can do. There are standard operating procedures, tactical directives, training, other elements that can be done to try and improve performance. But in the end, I mean, whereas I would agree that these are people that aren't setting out to kill civilians, there is what I think is an increasing recklessness in terms of the things that are calculated, things like selection of weaponry whenever aircraft are being equipped and preparing for the strikes that they're going to undertake on a given day. The fact that so many actors in Syria have chosen to use indiscriminate weapons, or they're choosing to use weaponry with large-scale effect. I mean, whenever you are going and trying to strike a building with delayed fused weaponry that's designed to as a demolition charge, effectively, as a bunker buster or other things, that the logical conclusion is that the building will collapse and anyone inside will die. That's not very proportionate. In terms of target selection, there are far too many hospitals that have been hit in the war in Syria to say that these pilots didn't know they were going in selecting a hospital with an airstrike. Same with schools, mosques, etc. IHL just doesn't have the currency. Protected objects does not have that dissuasive impact that it should.
Thank you all for these answers. And this whole discussion about the unintended effects of litigation, the fact that through bringing states to court because they have been this amount transparent, then you will get less transparency because they want to be brought less to court, is also something that would be interesting to discuss. But perhaps Robert, you want to say something on this or on the international humanitarian law?
Yes, thank you. Let me state at the outset, there's a lot in the case, right? There's a lot in the entire conflict, but there's a lot in the case that we've talked about tonight. I'll try to pull it apart from an IHL perspective, so from the humanitarian law perspective. I think there's some issues that need to be highlighted and some that just need to be posed as a question. First of all, I would like to separate the issue of precautions here from the legality of the target, because that's two things. The question whether or not the building was a lawful military target is something that is to be assessed individually, And the precautions are, how do you say, are an addendum to it. You need to make sure that the target is a lawful military target. Now, to me, it seems as if the precautions were, at the heart of the issue here, like we've heard before. Some of you said that the coalition should have known that the building was used as an IDP camp, and if that was known, precautions that should have been taken would have led to the conclusion not to hit the target. Being myself, I've never been to Syria, I've never been on the ground there. It's difficult for me to assess that, but we've heard three testimonies here of how difficult, or how clear, how obvious it was that the building was used as an IDP camp and not as a ISIS hideout or whatever. But let me play devil's advocate for some other issues here. Being a school does not make the building immune from attack. If a school is used in a military fashion, this school is a lawful military target. Now, in our case, where there were no obvious hints that it was used in a military fashion, that's out of the question. It's important to note, however, it's not a hindsight test. The perspective you have to choose from, or you have to stand on from an IHL perspective, is the perspective ex ante, meaning before the attack. Could the attackers have known that this was not a lawful military target? Now, from what we've heard, the answer seems obvious. And one more thing I would like to stress is what we've heard from Nadim. Being part of an ISIS family, if I might call it like this, does not make you a lawful military target. In no, or it's, how do you say, yeah, it just doesn't work. But there's other things, there's so much in it. We've heard of the truck that has a rocket-propelled grenade or whatever, a rocket launcher. Of course, that's a lawful military target. And the coalition could hit it. The question of collateral damage that the first three of you have talked a lot about, I think that's out of the question. It doesn't play a role. It does not make sense in our scenario. The question is the building a lawful military target? And the question of collateral damage is something secondary to that. But the primary question, is that a lawful military target, from what I've heard tonight? The answer is no, it's not. So the question of collateral damage doesn't even arise. And one more thing that I have asked myself two questions tonight. One of them is, now you want to have the German authorities have an investigation about what has happened. And from a lawyer perspective, or a German lawyer's perspective, the first question that I ask myself is, who's supposed to do that from the German authorities? Do you want the German MOD to have the investigation? That would point into the direction of the lessons learned, all right, for future attacks. What can the German military do better? Now, I guess, I'm just speculating, but if I was advising the German MOD, I would claim, look, the attack, what have we done, the Germans? We have provided intelligence. We have done precautions. That's all we did. The attack is on someone else, it's not on us. But everything we have done was in order to facilitate the adherence to IHL and human rights law, if that applies. That's the first thing. That would be the MOD perspective, or would be a plausible MOD perspective. The other one is, if, and no one has said that, if there's allegations of war crimes, that's a different German authority. And they would act differently. And they would probably come to a different result. But, I mean, given the German situation, where you don't know which authority should investigate, and then multiply that or exacerbate that with different countries that are responsible for that, that makes it almost practically impossible, in my mind, to have a, who's supposed to do that? We've seen the point of delusion of responsibility earlier. That's, I think, that's the core here, right? That's really problematic, because from a German perspective, I could just say we've done everything we could. That's it.
May I ask you, could you elaborate a bit more on the different authorities that should be dealing with these two different moments? in your opinion?
I hope I understood the question correctly. If it's just about lessons learned, and the question of recklessness, was the attack just reckless? And it wasn't even an accident, because they did exactly what they wanted to do. But about missing or lacking precautions, then it would be the MOD's probably the MOD's prerogative, and it would make sense for them to investigate. But if there were allegations of crimes committed, war crimes or whatever, intentionally hitting civilians, and no one talked about that tonight as far as I understood that. So that's off the table. But then it would be a task for the German criminal authorities to investigate that. And they would have a different standard and different perspectives or whatever, and they're not MOD. But I think that's the defining moment there.
Andreas, perhaps you want to add something on the human rights law perspective, and I would also be very happy if you could mention the recent success on the Yemeni case. Thanks to ECCHR, a huge step was made in the right direction.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think there are a number of things to say and to also give it a certain perspective. So one is here what we observe, and that's also why Air Wars and ECCHR organized this event tonight on the 2nd anniversary, because it's a really well documented strike, as we've learned, and it's quite rich what's out there, what's known, and it's always good, I think, to take exemplary cases, investigations, strikes to point to the bigger picture. And the bigger picture here is that for many, many years you have air strikes and air warfare by drones, but also in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Iraq by fighter jets and so on. But you have certain patterns you see here, and the patterns are basically that the law doesn't play a role, and you see that in many different parts of the law. So the first one we didn't talk tonight about, and I also don't want to go into detail, is there can you use force on the territory of that state at all? So that goes back to the UN Charter and the question of whether you can justify the right to self-defense, to use force, for example. So that's the first big legal questions you can say already a lot about into the context of those airstrikes. The second one is then, if you are in an armed conflict, what does IHL say about this, and how is IHL respected or not respected, and which role does IHL play in the context of the warfare and air warfare basically. And the third point is then what's the human rights law regime perspective in there and application. So and on all three aspects basically, states, including coalition states, including European states, including Germany, are fully disrespecting the law, and this has severe consequences, because for many years it was Germany, it was Europe, it was also the United States who were upholding international law, international legal standards, the UN system, all of that. And they don't do that anymore for a number of years. So the US started with that in 2001 with Guantanamo, with rendition flights, all of that. So where international law didn't play a role at all anymore, and new concepts were invented to at least give it a legal shining, that they would still respect it or talk in a legal language, but in the end, basically, they put it completely at the side. Germany and France opposed the 2003 Iraq invasion, so there was some resistance still there back then, but even since then, also Germany and France moved much more into the US direction with the drone strikes under the Obama administration, and also France being heavily involved in Syria, Iraq, but also in the Sahel zone and in Northern Africa. Basically getting rid of quite a number of legal standards there. So I think that's the biggest picture, that international law is under full attack here by government, by states who were upholding international law for many years, but changed that. And I think that's a big thing we want to address. And change in the end back to back to normal, I would say. But the question is, what's normal today? And but that's where we come from. And so coming back to the case you mentioned from where the judgment was rendered just yesterday, that's something we brought in a case in October 2014 on the drone strike on drone strikes in Yemen, but with a lot of similarities when it comes to the law. And we had a court hearing last week against the German Ministry of Defense in the courts for 10 hours discussing these questions actually before the judges, and then the decision yesterday, and there are a number of quite interesting questions in there where also basically the court said you have to respect international law. International law is the standard and not what you want politically, and then phrase the law according to your political will. No, you have to do a proper legal analysis what the law is, what customary law is, what state practice is, which informs customary law. And on that, you take a legal decision, and based on that, you can then see what's the political space is, what you act in. And that's not happening in terms of drone strikes, and that's not happening also in Syria when it comes to coalition strikes. And this strike here, I think, is a particular example of that. So briefly, what does that mean? It's on the selection of targets, principle of distinctions, one of the major principles in IHL, that you have to distinguish between a legitimate military target, as Robert said, and the civilian side property or civilian persons which are not allowed to be targeted. And by the practice and the policies the coalition uses in determining targets, and also the pattern of life analysis we saw on the pictures, you miss this principle of distinction already in the target selection, and many things follow from that. And so this principle of distinction has to be brought in, has to be applied much more strictly, and then you probably would also have other targeted decision and much less strikes, and then with that also much less civilian casualties. The human rights law comes also in at this point, and that's the question about what's the prohibition of arbitrary killings. And everywhere where a strike is not in conformity with IHL, a killing, I would say, is there's a high likelihood that the killing is also arbitrary, because the selection of the targets might be arbitrary, and also the determination basically of people they want to target. There might be arbitrary elements in that causes a lot of civilian life. So you have this argument in, and the other one is from the human rights law perspective, the duty to investigate, which is at stake here big times, because there's a constant failure to the duty of to investigate. Everything the coalition publishes does not have the level of an effective and independent investigation of any such incident. And and this is preventing further accountability, further lessons learned, and everything that follows from there. And if Germany provides images into a bombing campaign by the coalition based on those standards, and knowing that, then I would say also there's already the problem, and Germany needs to do the inquiries internally to see, if law is respective in these incidents, and if not, on a strict legal standard, they should get out of the coalition and not providing images which then can be used for rights violations. So the failure of the duty to investigate basically gives a justification for the German government to say we didn't know better, which then causes a contribution to the next rights violation. So you are in this circle, and I think these are some of the legal questions at stake here. But again, the broader picture is basically that also coalition states, including Germany, kind of abandoned international law, and that's the biggest problem, because then Russia and other states are following or using the same arguments, and you are in a circle of violence, which it's difficult to stop.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, everyone. I would now like to open the floor to questions. I would like to collect a couple. And then, yeah. Abigail?